This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to This Week in the Boardroom. I'm Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President with the NYSE, and today I'm joined as my guest is TK Kerstetter, who's Chairman, NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member. TK, you got to really know something about this topic today to be in that chair, but today we're actually going to talk about corporate governance guidelines, a board's foundation. And so I know you come prepared to be able to talk about this, this topic. Help frame the viewers why this is an important subject that we should be covering today.
Well, first of all, you knew if I'm going to move from that seat to this seat, that either there was something I wanted to say or, you know, because this is the seat that you get to talk more than doing it in that seat. So anyway, yeah, I felt that, you know, you and I have been covering things that, you know, maybe we've sort of overlooked in that because it seems sort of obvious. This is corporate governance guidelines. To a lot of people sort of seem obvious, but they certainly are growing in appreciation. When we think of corporate governance guidelines, we think of everything from how you're going to structure your board to mandatory age requirement or how you're going to handle your board and committee evaluations. All that stuff is sort of included. And, you know, it's a document that says to the world, you know, both the public and your investors, here's how we're going to operate and manage our corporate governance. So, you know, at first, you know, when I first was in this business, there was a reluctancy to sort of put that kind of information out to, you know, to lay out to everybody what was going to happen. Well, then, you know, sort of the Enron hits and the Sarbanes-Oxley hits, and, you know, and then, which I'll ask you in a minute, then the NYSE, you know, introduces its listing requirements, enhanced listing requirements. It always had those. But so all of a sudden it was important, and then investors made it important. They wanted to see this. So you could almost go into anybody's website today and you're going to see sort of this sort of projected out, you know, this is how we're going to operate our board. But it's interesting. I think that really took shape when the exchange said, you know, this is important. I wasn't here then. I'm not sure what you were, but you must have some philosophy on how that sort of evolved.
Well, anytime the exchange looks at changing its listing requirements, it really does so sort of in collaboration with listed companies, investors, the broker-dealer community, and with the SEC. And I think particularly coming out of the time periods that you referenced, there was a need for both enhanced disclosure as well as enhanced structure around corporate governance. And so the way that the NYSE from a continued listing and listing requirements standpoint looks at that is it's never been sort of a one-size-fit-all approach. There are certain foundational principles around director independence, committee structure that are set by fiat in the rule. But generally speaking, what's required is for companies to disclose the approach and the philosophy around the board and the board structure, and that gives investors the opportunity to understand, you know, what is and what are the guidelines that govern the behavior and decision making of a board. And that fundamentally is how it how it came about.
I know that everybody wants. I mean, whenever anybody wants to change, they're always hoping that they can get the NYSE to change their listing requirements because there's no other more powerful sort of tool than that tool. But again, if you sort of cater to everybody's whim, it would just be it would be a mess.
So going to the practical side, what have you seen with respect to different companies' approach to these governance guidelines?
Well, it's certainly being taken more seriously, and the companies that have always been good, you know, are on the front end of this. But this is a case where I think everybody has sort of followed suit, and you're seeing more and more attention put into this. For example, there are some that have term limits today. So in there, they map out in their guidelines exactly how they're going to deal with term limits. We've seen another that has a mandatory submission of resignation when a director changes its job status. Like, let's say they left the position or whatever, you have to submit your resignation to the board. The board then decides whether this change was significant enough that you should leave the board. Target, for example, has both of those provisions in theirs. IBM has the job status change, and they also, IBM, and this isn't true for everybody, IBM has a mandatory stock ownership guideline where within a period of 5 years of joining the board, you have to be holding up to 5 times your annual retainer in stock. And I'm assuming the purpose of that and the purpose of these typically is that they want the director to be in the same shoes, as the investor, and that's a great way, certainly, to do that. Another example is one of the companies I saw had a reputation clause. In other words, if you were arrested or if the company that you were affiliated with went into bankruptcy, then you had to submit your resignation, and the board again would rule on that. Same is true with the attendance guideline. The guideline typically says if you're missing more than 25% of the meetings, which means that you have to disclose that in your proxy.
Right.
Boards don't want that, so that they come back and say, hey, if you're missing more than that, we're gonna in essence meet with you and determine whether this is something chronic or whether that can be corrected. So, and one that was unique that I hadn't seen in a lot was Google, and Google has a provision there in their guidelines about how directors can access outside experts, okay? Which I thought was pretty interesting because that's
Right.
a debate all the time on what's happening. So when you look at this ends up to be almost like a charter for the board, and this is how we're going to operate our company, and we're going to disclose that to you as a way to making sure that we sort of fit that mold.
Yeah, and I think to that extent, these types of guidelines are accomplishing their goal. We talked about things like conflict of interest, term limits, the things that you identified. I actually think they also set the expectations for board members that are coming on, that are agreeing to their involvement in the board, and I think it's a great foundational principle to establish those guidelines. The only con I have against this, and it's just more of a warning, is that this not become a check the box and disclosure only type of process, but it really goes foundational to this is how the board operates, and I think for those companies that haven't quite gone to this level, I think you really do need to focus on what are the things that are going to be important for your board. That would be sort of, from my perspective, sort of taking this away from just rule and turning it into real substance.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and I think your point about orientation is just right on. I mean, this is jumping ahead, but I'm going to go ahead and answer this question anyway. One of the most important things that you want in board leadership is for everybody to have an understanding about this is the way we're going to operate, okay? So if you're the chairman or the head of the Nom/Gov committee or something like that, my recommendation is both with your code of conduct and with your corporate governance guidelines that annually you have directors sign off that you have read this and you understand this, because just like you do with employees in code of conduct and whatever, you don't want, you as leadership, if those things are violated, you want that to be an easy discussion. You don't want somebody to say, well, I wasn't aware of that or whatever. Now, if you're missing meetings or you've declared bankruptcy or whatever, that you know what to expect. I, as the chairman, am coming to you and saying we have a problem here. And if you can get stuff into that type of context, whether it's orientation or annually having people sign off, you're going to be a more effective leader or board leader in that sense.
Right. I mean, I actually think if you look at the trend of what we've seen on code of ethics and having those put in place in organizations, these governance principles, I think are going to be increasing in terms of adoption and also in importance and focus for boards. Particularly when we look at the focus that investors have today on board structure. So that's sort of my sense in terms of where this is going to go. But sort of last question is, where do you see this trending, and any sort of direction to the viewers here about how they should approach this?
Yeah, I mean, this whole session that we've just did is sort of supporting the notion that this is going to become more important, and I think it really will. All of these issues that I mentioned, if you went in to look at people's website, it's much more content than we've had a chance to touch on. And there's something new every day that you have to look at that. Most recently, we've seen the ISS add board tenure, to its quick score 2.0, where they consider somebody that's been over 9 years on the board, that they're going to grade against that if too many members of the board are within that over that 9-year period. So that was something that was just sort of bannered around. All of a sudden, that's getting more steam now. That's going to end up in people's corporate governance guidelines. So, how about you?
Well, I think it's no question, based on this discussion, that the board chair has a responsibility to look at these governance principles, to look at what the strategy is around governance for the board, and then obviously this is something that would fall clearly within most nominating and governance committees to review this on an annual basis, look at these guidelines and look and see if they continue to fit sort of the objectives of the board. And so I think it's good practice, you said it, to be able to go through this process on an annual basis.
It almost has to be annual.
Yeah,
so.
Great. Well, thanks, TK. This wraps up this show this week. We hope you found this discussion to be informative in your participation on boards, and we hope you can tune in to another session where we can talk about topics that make you effective board member or committee chair. Thank you.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.